Welcome back, everyone. It's well known that Muslims believe that the Quran is the word of Allah. It's His direct speech.
Quran is not a decoration. It's actually the word of Allah. It's the greatest word in existence.
The thing you read, the thing you recite, the thing you see, the thing you hear, this is Kalamullah Azza wa Jal, where Allah Azza wa Jal spoke it and given it and revealed it to us.
In this video, I will demonstrate one reason that is completely unreasonable, using Solomon as a case study. We've discussed Solomon in the Quran in prior videos, and we'll advance that case even further now. By the time we're finished, you'll see that Muslims can only defend the Quran as the speech of Allah using desperate tactics that I will outline at the end of this video. Here's what we'll look at: the likely origin of the multitude of Solomon legends. If you aren't aware, there are a ton of them throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages. We'll also examine a literary source of Solomon's power over spirits. Let's begin with the likely origin of the multitude of Solomon legends. Many viewers will already be familiar with Solomon's portrayal in the Quran. Here are a few brief examples. He controlled the Satans and jinn to do his bidding. He understood the speech of animals, and he had power over the wind, which he used for his own transportation. Combine all that with a mysterious figure on his throne and the water test that I've talked about in prior videos, and the Quran's portrayal of Solomon may start to seem a bit fanciful. Similar stories about Solomon predate Islam by centuries. But how did Solomon grow to such posthumous fame? There really isn't much in the biblical tradition to start from, at least at first glance. God granted Solomon a wide breadth of wisdom. He was the son of King David, and that's kind of about it. But as you may know from previous videos on this channel, some ancient commentators had a knack for creative biblical interpretation, and out of those interpretations grew legends, and many of those legends made it into the Islamic sources in spite of attempts to filter out those Israelite tales. In the Old Testament, we find the book of Ecclesiastes, which is traditionally attributed to Solomon. Chapter 2, verse 8 reads, "I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines." The Hebrew words behind the underlined section, many concubines, gave ancient interpreters some trouble. With additional lexical data in the modern period, we're much more certain of the meaning. However, some rabbinic sources opted for another, much more creative translation that did not fit the context at all. But that didn't matter. They took that and they ran with it. Thus, the Hebrew is translated by some as demons. And why did Solomon need them? To build the temple. More on that later. And of course, the Quran echoes the story in chapters 34 and 38. The jinn made for him whatever he pleased, places of prayer and statues and basins, like cisterns, fixed cooking pots, etc. And chapter 38 talks about Satans, builders and divers, who worked for Solomon. I also mentioned Solomon was the son of King David. 1 Samuel 16 tells the story of a spirit that troubles King Saul. He would call for David. David apparently was quite a soothing musician, and he would calm the king. This is likely another piece of the puzzle that explains Solomon's power over spirits. He inherited it from David. The notion that Solomon could have inherited some of David's traits is, of course, logical since he was his son, and it's also interesting that this is precisely how the Quran explains Solomon's wisdom and abilities to speak to animals. We certainly gave David and Solomon knowledge, and they said, "Praise be to God who has favored us over many of his believing servants." Solomon inherited it from David, and said, "People, we have been taught the speech of birds," etc. While these links to the biblical literature are worth noting once one is familiar with how extra-biblical traditions take on a mind of their own in the literature of antiquity, further explanation may still be warranted. Are there additional reasons for Solomon's fame? The theory put forward 2 decades ago in Pablo Torrejano's study on Solomon requires serious consideration. He postulated that Solomon underwent a sort of Hellenization, recast as a deified king, something common in Greek culture. This deification depicted the king either as the earthly representation of a god or as the god incarnate. It is likely that as gods, Hellenistic rulers were viewed as having special powers. They acquired some of the abilities of the divine man. Thus, Vespasian, when hailed as emperor in Alexandria, performed several miracles. It is most probable, then, that at some point, part of this type of monarchic ideology was incorporated into the process of the historical idealization of the Jewish monarchy. This incorporation supposed, nonetheless, a reworking of these ideas so that they were not totally incompatible with the monotheistic beliefs of Judaism. Thus, the Septuagint vision of Solomon as Hellenistic king could be easily reinterpreted in that sense because the divinity of the Hellenistic ruler was based on his alleged superiority, and in the case of Solomon, that superiority was unquestionable and stated in an absolute manner by the text. He also clarifies that power over spirits is another typical feature of these deified rulers. So it seems that we have identified some of the sources of the Solomon legends, as well as a Hellenistic setting in which they were able to sprout and grow to massive proportions. He continues, it is most probable that the traditions that contained information about Solomon and the demons were quite common as early as the 2nd century BCE. The origin of such a link could be due to a transformation of the Hellenistic royal ideology with its interest in the extraordinary abilities and power of the king, regarded as an individual and with a close relationship to the divine. Such royal ideology, combined with some attributes taken from the figure of the divine man, who in virtue of his superior intellect could rule the spiritual world, is probably the basis for the formation of the Solomonic tradition of exorcism. So far, we've seen very plausible explanations for Solomon's fame throughout antiquity and his power over spirits, which are closely connected. Some seeds of this are in the Hebrew Bible. If incorrectly but creatively interpreted, we can see Solomon getting his demons in Ecclesiastes, and David soothed Saul when he was troubled by a spirit, so David must have had exorcist powers, which would have been passed on to his son Solomon. In a few Dead Sea Scrolls, Solomon is indeed an exorcist who wields a magical formula to control demons, and the Testament of Solomon, which long predates Islam, is a pseudepigraphic work that functions effectively as an instruction manual for exorcisms. Then there's the catalyst of the Hellenistic king. Solomon's proximity to the divine made him larger than life. The similarity this bears with just a few examples from the Quran is obviously striking. These are the verses I showed you earlier, and it's probably worth considering a couple of them again against the background we've just covered. Chapter 21, among the Satans, there were those who died for him and did other work besides. And from chapter 34, the jinn made for him whatever he pleased, places of prayer, statues, basins, and so forth. Now, this close connection between controlling the spirits and building something is understandable against the background of the Talmud. When Solomon was building the temple, it said that the sound of hammers and axes were not heard in the house of the Lord during construction. How could such a thing be accomplished? Well, the Talmud goes on to describe how Solomon leveraged his spirits to figure that out. I don't want to ruin the story for you if you want to read it yourself, but apparently if you kidnap a couple demons, they'll tell you just about anything. So there's a free tip. Centuries after Solomon lived, an impressive amount of literature was produced about him. He was likely fashioned as a Hellenistic deified king that fit within a Jewish monotheistic framework, and his proximity to the divine gave him all sorts of incredible abilities. Some of these accounts resulted from a creative interpretation of the much less colorful biblical text, while some of this legendary material served to answer biblical questions that the rabbis had, like how was the temple built? But there is an alternative explanation that our Muslim friends would have us believe, namely, that these stories, at least as they're confirmed in the Quran, are true. Our attempts to trace the sources and development of these ideas are simply mistaken. The source is Allah. The Quran is his speech, and we're to think nothing of the fact that the Quran, I suppose by mere coincidence, appears so heavily influenced by a milieu that had been replete with Solomon legends for centuries. And we've looked only at a couple of examples of how legends originate, develop, and make it into the Islamic sources, and there are many, many more. And as we begin to weigh the plausibility of these two competing theses of the Quran Solomon stories, here are some typical Muslim objections to this sort of content. The first two are circular. The traditions retold in the Quran are true. After all, they're in the Quran. So by default, the various stories that appear in the Quran are also the word of Allah. So all of these accounts about Abraham, Solomon, Alexander the Great, and so forth in the Quran, they aren't legends. They're true because they're in the Quran. They're also the word of Allah, perhaps even in the original source, like the Testament of Solomon. I don't know. They aren't the product of creative interpretation or anything else. So Muslims are free to reach the conclusion that to the extent the Quran uses its sources, those sources are also divine speech. However, such a conclusion is reached by presupposing the Quran is the true word of Allah in the first place. This is obviously not a serious argument. Muslims also like to pick a likely Quranic source, then select some date of a late manuscript, then claim the source is late, and likely even borrowed from the Quran. When it comes to the sources that I've used in this video, and many others in similar videos, that is simply not responsible. Even taking the very conservative date for the composition of the Quran assumed by Muslims Pre-Islamic sources abound, whose origin can be determined and development traced directly into an uncanny resemblance with what we see in the Islamic sources, including the Quran. If the Quran's authors didn't borrow from stories circulating in their day, then we must simply have striking coincidence after striking coincidence after striking coincidence, etc. Next, Muhammad couldn't read, so he couldn't have plagiarized. This is a transparently stupid objection for numerous reasons. It presupposes that the only way to get, for example, legends of Solomon into the Quran is for Muhammad to sit down with a manuscript of the Testament of Solomon, the Talmud, or whatever, translate it and copy it into chapter 34. That is ridiculous. It's not what I'm claiming. Also, Muhammad's illiteracy is a product of Islamic apologetics and doesn't even cohere with the Islamic sources themselves. The more illiterate Muhammad was, the more miraculous the Quran is. An argument so bizarre, senseless, and utterly worn out that I hardly have the patience to deal with it anymore. The compilers of the Quran heard these very popular stories about Solomon and others in some form, written, oral, whatever, consider them authentic enough to make it into the Quran, not to mention the Hadith and other sources. It's that simple. How it happened precisely would be interesting to know, but ultimately it's irrelevant. The coherence of the Quran with what we see in pre-Islamic legends demonstrates without a doubt that it happened, and that is the point. The illiteracy argument is just another example of a sideshow in the circus of Muslim apologetics. A sideshow in the circus of Muslim apologetics. That's good. I'm going to write that one down. Finally, another worn-out tactic, what I call, hey, look over there. Muslims will simply find some way to distract from the content of this and similar videos. There are several ways they generally do this, but it's also predictable and uninteresting, then who cares? What I would recommend is that Muslims who feel defensive after watching this don't comment at all. Grab your Quran and read the passages I showed you. Then read the Talmud selection I gave you. Read the Testament of Solomon. Read about the magical powers of deified Greek kings and think about how those ideas could have been developed in a Jewish context for someone like Solomon. Compare all of this with what you've read in the Quran, then explain to me why the proposition that the Quran is the divine speech of Allah is a remotely defensible proposition against the thesis that I've advanced in this video. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.